I am 88 years old, and my whole life I believed that leaving something for my children was the greatest proof of love a father could offer. I spent decades in that belief, decades tightening my belt, refusing trips I desperately wanted to take, eating the same old humble meals, giving up small pleasures any man deserves, while saving every pound as if it were the last reserve of dignity I still possessed. I've lived in Brighton for 60 years, in the same townhouse in Forest Hill, a house that smells of stagnant time, old floor wax, and memories no one bothers to ask about anymore. And it was here, in this house full of past, that my life finally truly began. My name is Reginald Taylor. I was a carpenter for 30 years, working with wood since I was 18, smelling the cedar and the sawdust in my hair like someone wearing a perfume of honor. Then I retired, raised 2 children, lost my beloved Eleanor to a long and silent illness, and spent the last 15 years being what the world affectionately calls a decent old man. Do you know what that means? It means being polite enough, useful when someone needs you, and invisible when no one remembers you exist anymore. It means smiling when your children rush in with hurried faces and stories of installments and overdue bills, and pretending those visits are pure affection, when in reality they are reconnaissance missions, inventory visits before the actual inventory. It was on an April afternoon that everything changed inside me. My son Claude showed up without warning, as he always does. 45 years old, neatly cut hair, imported cologne, the kind of man who always seems to be in a hurry even when completely still. He walked in through the door I hadn't even properly closed, tossed his keys onto my mahogany desk, the one I built myself 40 years ago with my own hands, and threw himself onto the leather sofa without even looking me in the eye for more than 2 seconds. I was at the window, looking at the mango tree in the backyard, which had bloomed more than ever that year. I asked him how he was. He said he was tired, that his car had suspension problems, that the payments were weighing too heavily on his budget. His car, I must say with all the calm I could maintain, costs more than my first house here in Forest Hill, bought with 10 years of savings and much sacrifice. I listened to everything with the patience that only old age can teach. And then he asked, without any embarrassment on his face, if I had gone to the registry office to update my will because the real estate market in Brighton was changing very quickly and it would be prudent to regularize everything while I was still able to do so. While I was still able to, I stared at him for a long moment. He didn't notice. His attention was on his phone, sliding his finger across the screen with that mechanical familiarity of someone who prefers life in small pieces to facing people whole. And I saw, at that precise instant, with a clarity that hurts when it comes too late, that for my son I was not a father. I was a line of credit with a name and surname. I was a future expectation awaiting the right moment to be activated. I was useful not for who I was, but for what I would cease to be when my time here came to an end. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in the darkness of my room, listening to the neighborhood noise outside, the barking of Mrs. Nancy's dog next door, the distant sound of a bus going down the street, and thought about my entire life with a fierce honesty I had never dared to exercise before. I thought about the years I worked double shifts to pay for Claude's tuition at a private university. I thought about the apartment I helped my daughter Sonia buy when she was 30. I thought about the times I said no to myself so I could say yes to them. And I realized, with that lucidity that only comes when you stop lying to yourself, that I had never truly done any of this for them. I had done it for myself, for the comforting illusion that money was synonymous with love, for the need to prove to myself and to the world that I had been a good father. But a good father is not one who leaves a fortune behind. It is one who teaches his children to build their own fortunes with their own hands and their own determination. And I, with all my lifelong dedication, had done exactly the opposite. I had raised two adults who looked at the future and saw my assets where they should have seen their own strength. I called them both for a chat the following Saturday. We sat in the living room. Sonia arrived worried because such a summons, out of the blue, always awakens the instinct of someone expecting difficult news. Claude arrived with that air of someone already calculating the implications even before sitting down. I served coffee, sat in my usual chair by the window, and spoke with a calm that surprised even myself. I said I had made a decision, that I would sell the house, that I would spend my savings however I wanted, that I would leave no inheritance, neither for one nor for the other, that Dad's bank had permanently closed for business. The silence that settled in that room was the kind that hurts inside. Sonia turned pale as a wall. She asked what would become of the grandchildren, of the children's college, of the entire family's financial security. Her voice trembled, but I knew that tremble well. It wasn't the pain of a daughter who loves her father. It was the shock of someone losing ground that was never truly hers to begin with. I looked at her with all the love a father carries in his chest and said clearly without anger, "If you still need a safety net from a man who can barely bend his knees without pain, then I made an essential mistake somewhere along the way. It's time, my daughter, to learn to fly with your own wings." Claude said nothing. He kept looking at me with an expression I couldn't interpret at that moment. He slowly stood up, picked up his keys from the desk, and left without saying goodbye. Sonia left soon after, with red eyes and a firm chin, like someone holding back a lot to say later, at a moment when words hurt more. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us from which city you are watching us. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you will ever hear in your life. And I was left alone in the living room with the coffee cooling in Eleanor's old porcelain cup, and I felt something I hadn't felt in many years. I felt that I had done the right thing. For the first time in a long time, I had acted for myself, for the truth I owed myself before owing it to anyone else. Sonia went 3 weeks without calling me, 3 weeks of silence that, instead of breaking me in half, taught me more about our relationship than entire years of polite visits and Sunday lunches. When there was no money involved, what was left between us? That was the question the 3 weeks answered. And the answer hurt the way all truth hurts when it arrives later than it should. But I had already decided. Reginald Taylor, at 88, was finally going to start living the life he had always deserved to live. The first thing I did after that meeting was call my old friend Gerald, a retired carpenter who lives in Primrose Hill, and who for years had been telling me that I was wasting my last years saving things for people who didn't need them. He recommended a small workshop available for rent on the street behind his house, a space smelling of old wood and sawdust accumulated in the floor cracks. I signed the contract the same week. It had been 40 years since I had plunged my hands into a piece of cedar with the intention of creating something. 40 years. When I picked up the plane for the first time that Thursday afternoon, my hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but from recognition. It was like rediscovering a language I thought I had forgotten and realizing it was still there, buried in my fingers, waiting to be spoken again. The aroma of the wood enveloped me like an old embrace, and for a moment, in that simple shed, lit by the afternoon light, I was 25 again. I started working every day. I woke up early, had coffee with the calm of someone who no longer needed to rush anywhere, caught the bus at the Forest Avenue stop, and headed to the workshop. I started by making small things, a little box to store tools, an IPE wood picture frame, a long bench of pink cedar. Each piece was a dialogue between me and the material, a wordless conversation where the wood said what it wanted to be, and I just listened with my hands. My joints, which hurt so much on cold Brighton mornings, seemed to unlock with constant movement, as if my body recognized that it was being used in the right way after a long time of being still. The doctor would say it was a coincidence. I knew it wasn't. The body knows when the soul is at peace. With the money I began to release, not for inheritance but for myself, I made another decision I would never have dared to make before. I started inviting myself to dinner, alone, in elegant restaurants in downtown and Soho, sitting at a good table, ordering wine I never allowed myself, talking to waiters who treated me with the dignity every human being deserves and which I had denied myself for decades. On one of those nights, a woman in her 70s asked if she could share my table because the restaurant was full. Her name was Alice, she had lively eyes and a generous laugh, and she told me that she too was learning to live for herself after a lifetime dedicated to others. We talked for 3 hours. We exchanged phone numbers. She became my most constant companion during that period, not a hurried soap opera romance, but a dense and honest friendship between two old people who finally had permission to exist without apologizing for it. Alice introduced me to a group of people our age who met on Wednesdays at a cafe in Richmond to chat, play cards, and sometimes simply sit in comfortable silence near each other. I, who had spent years thinking old age was a waiting room, discovered it could be a party. Sonia called again after almost a month. Her voice was different, more subdued, less calculated. She asked how I was. She didn't ask about the will, about the house, about the money. She asked if I was well. It was the first time in years that question from her sounded true. I said I was great, that I had returned to carpentry, that I was dining out every week. She was silent for a moment and then said, "Dad, you seem like a different person." I replied that I wasn't different. I was the same as always. What had changed was that I had finally stopped hiding behind what others needed from me. Claude took longer, but one day he appeared at the workshop without calling first, without announcing himself. He stood in the doorway for a full minute, watching me work with the wood, my hands covered in sawdust, my glasses fogged from the effort. Then he came in, pulled up a stool, and sat beside me. We remained silent for a long time, the sound of the sandpaper filling the space between us. And then he asked, in a voice I hadn't heard since he was about 12, what it was like to work with wood. He didn't ask about inheritance. He didn't ask about the will. He asked about my work, about my life, about me. That afternoon in the workshop was the first real conversation my son and I had had in over 20 years. He told me he was scared, that he felt trapped in a life pattern he didn't know how he had built, that he woke up every day with the feeling that he was running without knowing where to. I listened to everything without judgment, without giving advice, without being the father who provided easy answers. I just listened. And in the end, I just said this: the fear you feel isn't weakness, Claude. It's a sign that you're still awake. Now it's your turn to figure out what to do with it. He left feeling lighter, and so did I. The chalet I bought on the shore of a lake in the Lake District region took 2 months to renovate. I participated in part of the work myself, guiding the builders on the woods, choosing every detail with the care of someone building the place where they would finally breathe deeply. On the day I moved in, I carried only what was necessary. My clothes, the mahogany desk, the picture frame with Eleanor's photo, and a bouquet of yellow roses that Alice gave me as a housewarming gift. Sitting on the chalet's porch, looking at the still water of the lake reflecting the afternoon clouds, I thought of all the old people I know who still guard what they have with trembling hands, waiting for the moment that will never be the right one to start living. And I want to say to each of them, with the conviction of someone who learned this in the hardest and most beautiful way, there is no greater inheritance than your own joy. When you truly live, when you laugh, when you create, when you love unconditionally and without transaction, you teach more than any amount deposited in an account could ever teach. My children don't need my money. They needed to see that it was possible to start over at 88. That life isn't a countdown waiting for the end. That every morning smelling of coffee and wood and lake is a gift that no will can contain. I gave them the only legacy worth anything, the living proof that it's never too late to be who you always were.